Picture this. A young German noblewoman, barely 24, stares at herself in a looking glass as court painters meticulously capture every detail of her face. She doesn't know it yet, but this portrait, commissioned by the most dangerous king in Europe, will both save her life and doom her to a fate worse than the executioner's block. And of Cleves believed she was marrying into power and prestige. Instead, she was walking into a psychological torture chamber that would strip away everything she thought she knew about herself, leaving her to face a death that came not with the swift fall of an axe, but with the slow, suffocating weight of a carefully constructed prison made of silk and gold. The woman history remembers as the lucky one, who escaped Henry VIII matrimonial carnage, would discover that sometimes survival is its own form of execution. For centuries, Anne of Cleves has been painted with the broad brushstrokes of historical convenience. The plain German bride who escaped death because her marriage was quickly annulled. The fortunate fourth wife who outlived the tyrant king and died peacefully in her sleep. This narrative, comfortable in its simplicity, has obscured one of the most psychologically complex and haunting stories of the Tudor court. The truth about Anne of Cleves is far more disturbing than the clean narrative of royal divorce and comfortable retirement. Her story is not one of lucky escape, but of systematic destruction. A methodical dismantling of identity, purpose, and agency that left her trapped in a gilded cage for the remainder of her days. While her predecessors faced the terror of the scaffold and faced something arguably worse, the slow erasure of herself, orchestrated by a king who understood that sometimes the cruelest punishment is not death, but a hollow existence stripped of everything that makes life worth living. To understand the true horror of Anne's fate, we must first understand the woman she was before Henry VIII's machinery of manipulation began its work, transforming a confident foreign princess into a shadow of her former self. Anna von Jülich-Kleve-Berg was born into one of the most powerful families in the Holy Roman Empire. The daughter of John III, Duke of Cleves, she was raised in a court that valued intelligence, religious tolerance, and political acumen, unlike the sheltered English noblewomen of Henry's court, and had been educated in statecraft, languages, and the complex dance of European diplomacy. She spoke German, Dutch, and French fluently, understood Latin, and possessed a sharp mind for political strategy. When Hans Holbein the Younger arrived in Dusseldorf in 1539 to paint her portrait, Anne was not the naive young woman history often portrays. At 24, she was already considered past the typical marrying age for nobility, having rejected several suitors to maintain her independence. Her brother Wilhelm, Duke of Cleves, had specifically cultivated her political education, recognizing her value as a diplomatic asset in the volatile landscape of Reformation Europe. The portrait Holbein created was technically accurate but diplomatically enhanced. And strong features were softened, her intelligent eyes made more demure, her practical German fashion replaced with jewels and finery that suggested both wealth and tractability. Most crucially, the portrait could not capture what would prove to be Anne's greatest liability in Henry's court: her unshakable sense of self-worth and her inability to play the submissive English wife. When Henry VIII first laid eyes on Holbein's masterpiece, he saw what he wanted to see: a foreign princess who would bring him political alliance with the Protestant German states, a woman who appeared malleable enough to mold to his specifications, and a bride who might finally provide the male heir that had eluded him through 3 previous marriages. What he could not see in the static image was the steel beneath Anne's composed exterior, the intelligence that would question his decisions, the dignity that would refuse to be broken, and the political sophistication that would recognize manipulation when she saw it. Anne's journey to England began with triumph. She traveled with a magnificent retinue, her baggage trains loaded with the finest German craftsmanship and her own considerable dowry. She carried letters from Protestant reformers across Europe, viewing her marriage as an opportunity to influence English religious policy and create a powerful Protestant alliance against Catholic France and Spain. She was, in every sense, a woman with her own agenda. This confidence, this sense of purpose, would prove to be her undoing. Henry VIII had not married a political partner. He had acquired what he believed to be a decorative appendage to his throne. The collision between Anne's expectations and Henry's reality would create a psychological warfare so subtle and devastating that its effects would resonate through every remaining day of her life. The first crack in Anne's confidence appeared not at the altar, but in a frozen pavilion at Rochester Castle on January 1st, 1540. Henry VIII, overcome by romantic delusions fed by months of staring at Holbein's portrait, had decided to surprise his bride with an impromptu meeting. Disguised as a humble messenger, he burst into Anne's chambers expecting to be recognized by love's divine spark, as if he were living out one of the chivalric romances he adored. Anne's reaction was swift and devastating. She looked at this rough, obese stranger with obvious disgust and turned back to her conversation with her German attendants. She had no idea she was looking at her future husband. When Henry's identity was revealed, her shock was palpable, her courtesy forced and transparent. In that moment, the king's ego suffered a wound that would fester into vindictive cruelty. But the wedding proceeded. On January 6, 1540, Anne of Cleves became Henry VIII's fourth queen in a ceremony that was magnificent on the surface and rotten at its core. Henry had already begun planning her destruction, but he masked his intentions behind the pageantry of royal celebration, and, unaware of the psychological trap closing around her, threw herself into her role as Queen of England with Germanic thoroughness and efficiency. She learned English with remarkable speed, studied the complex protocols of the English court, and began building relationships with key nobles and clergy. Her approach was methodical and intelligent. She recognized that her power lay not in feminine wiles but in political competence. She began corresponding with Protestant reformers, hosting theological discussions, and positioning herself as a bridge between English and continental Protestantism. This was precisely what Henry could not tolerate. He had not married a political partner. He had acquired what he believed should be an ornamental wife. Anne's intelligence, her independence, her refusal to disappear into the background of his court life, all of these became evidence of her unsuitability. But rather than simply executing her, as he had done with Anne Boleyn, Henry chose a more sophisticated form of cruelty. He began the systematic destruction of her identity through a campaign of humiliation so subtle that even Anne herself did not initially recognize what was happening. Court gossips were encouraged to comment on her appearance, her foreign mannerisms, her inability to please the king. Her German attendants were gradually dismissed and replaced with English women loyal to Henry. Her correspondence was monitored, her movements restricted, her access to independent sources of information carefully controlled. Most devastatingly, Henry began the process of sexual humiliation that would define the rest of Anne's life. He publicly proclaimed his inability to consummate their marriage, not because of his own physical limitations, but because of her repulsive appearance. He described her body in graphic, degrading terms to his courtiers, ensuring that every person in the royal circle would view Anne not as their queen, but as a woman so physically revolting that even the king could not bring himself to touch her. This was psychological warfare of the most sophisticated kind. Henry was not simply rejecting Anne. He was systematically destroying her sense of self-worth, her confidence, her very identity as a woman. Every time she appeared in public, she knew that everyone present was thinking about her sexual inadequacy, her physical repulsiveness, her failure as a wife. By June 1540, Henry had assembled the legal machinery necessary to destroy Anne's marriage, but the annulment process itself became another layer of her psychological torment. Rather than simply dissolving the union on political grounds, Henry chose to base the annulment on non-consummation, forcing Anne to submit to intimate medical examinations by court physicians who would testify about her physical condition. The humiliation was deliberate and comprehensive, and was required to appear before committees of clergymen and lawyers who questioned her in explicit detail about her sexual experiences, both before and during her brief marriage. She was forced to confirm, in formal legal testimony, that her husband found her so physically repugnant that he could not perform his marital duties. Every aspect of her most private self was dissected, recorded, and made part of the public record. But the true cruelty lay not in the annulment itself, but in the terms of Anne's survival. Henry offered her a choice that was no choice at all. She could contest the annulment, almost certainly facing charges of treason and execution, or she could accept his terms and live comfortably as his beloved sister for the rest of her days. The catch was that accepting his terms meant accepting his narrative of her fundamental inadequacy as a woman. and, with the political intelligence that had initially attracted Henry's interest, recognized the trap immediately. She could live, but only by agreeing that she deserved to be rejected, that she was physically repulsive, that she had failed in the most basic function of noble womanhood. Her survival depended on internalizing and publicly accepting Henry's systematic destruction of her self-worth. The settlement Henry offered was generous in material terms. She would receive substantial properties, including Richmond Palace and Sion House, along with an annual income that made her one of the wealthiest women in England. She would hold an honored position at court as the king's adopted sister, ranking above all other ladies except Henry's current wife and daughters. She would have servants, luxury, comfort, and security. What she would not have was agency, purpose, or the possibility of creating an independent life. The terms of her settlement explicitly forbade her from leaving England without the king's permission. She could not marry without royal consent. She could not return to her family in Germany. She could not engage in independent political correspondence. She could not even control her own household staff, who reported regularly to Henry's agents about her activities, visitors, and private conversations, and accepted these terms on July 9, 1540, in a ceremony that was designed to look like magnanimous royal generosity but was actually a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. She publicly thanked Henry for his kindness, praised his wisdom in recognizing their incompatibility, and accepted her role as his beloved sister. Every word was scripted, every gesture calculated to reinforce the narrative of her inadequacy and his benevolence. But those who knew and could see what this acceptance cost her. The confident German princess who had arrived in England just 7 months earlier was already beginning to fade, replaced by a more subdued figure who spoke carefully, moved cautiously, and seemed to shrink a little more each day. And of Cleves's life after her annulment became a study in the sophisticated cruelties possible within the framework of royal benevolence. Henry VIII had created for her a prison so elegant that it appeared to be a paradise, a form of captivity so comfortable that escape seemed ungrateful. This was her true punishment. Not death, but a living death disguised as privilege. Her primary residence, Richmond Palace, was indeed magnificent. Built by Henry VII as a symbol of Tudor power, it boasted hundreds of rooms, elaborate gardens, and every luxury imaginable. Anne's household staff numbered in the dozens. She had her own cooks, seamstresses, musicians, and chaplains. Her wardrobe was filled with the finest silks and furs. Her stables held the most beautiful horses in the kingdom. By any material measure, she lived like royalty. But material comfort could not disguise the reality of her situation. Anne's correspondence reveals a woman gradually losing her sense of purpose and identity. Her early letters, written in the months following her annulment, maintain the political sophistication and sharp intelligence that had characterized her before her marriage. She discusses European politics, religious reform, and court intrigue with the insight of someone accustomed to wielding power. As the years passed, however, her letters became shorter, more superficial, focused on mundane domestic details rather than the great questions of statecraft that had once consumed her attention. She began to write about her gardens, her pets, her health complaints, and the small ceremonial duties that filled her days. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. The political sophisticate was being replaced by a decorative figurehead. The psychological pressure was constant but subtle, and could not travel without permission, and permission was rarely granted. Her requests to visit her family in Germany were politely refused year after year. When her brother Wilhelm wrote urging her to return home, especially as Protestant Catholic tensions escalated across Europe, and was forced to decline, explaining that the king's generosity required her continued presence in England, her social isolation was nearly complete. While she maintained her ceremonial position at court, she had no real friends among the English nobility. The German attendants who might have provided emotional support and cultural continuity had been systematically removed from her household. The English ladies assigned to serve her were courtiers first and companions second, their loyalty ultimately to Henry rather than to and herself. Most devastatingly, Anne was denied the possibility of creating new relationships that might have provided meaning and purpose. Her unmarried status was not the temporary condition of a divorced woman seeking a new husband, but a permanent state mandated by her settlement with Henry. She could not marry without royal permission, and such permission was never even contemplated. At 25, she was condemned to lifelong celibacy not by religious vocation but by royal decree. The religious implications were particularly cruel, and had been raised in a Protestant court where marriage was considered a divine calling for both men and women. Celibacy was associated with Catholic monasticism, a practice that Protestant theology generally rejected as unnatural. By forcing an into permanent unmarried status, Henry was not only denying her personal fulfillment, but condemning her to a life that contradicted her deepest religious convictions. As the years accumulated, the psychological effects of Anne's gilded imprisonment became increasingly visible to those who knew her. Visitors to her court, particularly those who had known her in Germany, commented on the dramatic changes in her personality and bearing. The confident, politically astute princess they remembered had been replaced by a more subdued figure who seemed to have internalized the narrative of her own inadequacy. Anne's relationship with food became a source of particular concern among her household staff. Always naturally robust in the Germanic tradition, she began eating compulsively, her weight increasing dramatically over the years following her annulment. Modern psychological understanding suggests this was a classic response to trauma and loss of control. Food became one of the few areas where Anne could exercise agency, even as that agency took increasingly self-destructive forms. Her appearance, once carefully maintained according to the standards of European nobility, began to deteriorate. She showed little interest in fashion or personal grooming, often appearing in the same simple dresses for days at a time. Her German attendants had been replaced by English servants who had little understanding of or sympathy for her cultural background, and Anne seemed to lose interest in maintaining the standards of dress and deportment that had once defined her status. More troubling were the reports of her increasing reclusiveness. Anne had always been naturally social, comfortable with the complex social interactions required of nobility. But as her isolation deepened, she began withdrawing from even the limited social opportunities available to her. She would spend days in her private chambers, emerging only for mandatory court appearances or religious services. Her correspondence during this period reveals a woman struggling to understand her own identity. In letters to her family, she alternated between defending her situation as comfortable and secure and expressing subtle requests for rescue that she could never make explicit. She wrote about her contentment with her retirement from the cares of married life, but also mentioned her longing for the familiar landscapes and customs of her homeland. The religious implications of her situation became increasingly complex, and had arrived in England as a sophisticated Protestant theologian, capable of engaging with the most learned reformers of her day. But her forced isolation from political life meant that she was cut off from the intellectual religious community that had once given her life meaning. She attended chapel services regularly, but these were formal observances rather than opportunities for genuine spiritual engagement. Henry's agents, who continued to monitor her activities throughout his reign, reported that and showed increasing signs of what modern psychology would recognize as depression. She slept irregularly, often staying in bed well into the afternoon. She showed little interest in activities that had once brought her pleasure, such as music and reading. She began exhibiting the physical symptoms of chronic stress: frequent headaches, digestive problems, and a general air of fatigue that no amount of rest seemed to cure. Perhaps most significantly, Anne began to lose her facility with languages. Once fluent in German, Dutch, French, and increasingly proficient in English, she began reverting to her native German in moments of stress or confusion. Her English servants, who spoke no German, found her increasingly difficult to understand. This linguistic regression was more than a practical problem. It was a symptom of her psychological retreat from the English identity that had been forced upon her. When Henry VIII died in January 1547, many expected that Anne of Cleves might finally reclaim some measure of independence. The new boy king, Edward VI, ruled through a council of regents who had no personal investment in maintaining Henry's psychological torment of his former wife. Theoretically, Anne was free to renegotiate the terms of her settlement, perhaps even to return to Germany if she chose. But by this time, the damage was too profound to be easily reversed, and had spent 7 years internalizing the narrative of her own inadequacy, 7 years cut off from the political and cultural contexts that had once given her life meaning. The confident princess who had once debated theology with continental reformers had been replaced by a woman who seemed genuinely to believe that she deserved her isolation. Her response to Henry's death was telling. Rather than celebrating her liberation or immediately seeking to change her circumstances, and wrote to the new government confirming her satisfaction with her existing arrangements. She expressed gratitude for Henry's generosity and requested that her settlement be continued unchanged. This was not a woman seeking freedom, but someone who had become so psychologically dependent on her cage that the prospect of leaving it seemed more terrifying than remaining trapped. The few visitors who saw and during Edward VI's brief reign reported that she had become almost unrecognizable. The vibrant young woman of 1539 had been replaced by someone who seemed decades older than her actual age. She moved slowly and carefully, as if afraid of taking up too much space. She spoke little, and when she did speak, it was often to repeat the phrases Henry had taught her about her contentment with her situation. Most tragically, and seemed to have lost the ability to imagine alternative futures for herself. When her brother Wilhelm wrote suggesting that she might return to Germany to help with the religious and political challenges facing their family's territories, Anne's response was not practical but psychological. She could not envision herself as someone capable of playing a meaningful role in political life. The systematic destruction of her confidence had been so thorough that she genuinely believed herself unfit for the responsibilities she had once handled with ease. Her household staff during these final years reported increasingly erratic behavior, and would sometimes spend entire days rearranging her possessions, as if trying to create some sense of control in a life where all meaningful choices had been removed. She developed obsessive routines around meals, clothing, and daily activities, clinging to small rituals that provided the illusion of agency. Her religious life, once sophisticated and intellectually engaged, became mechanical and repetitive. She attended services but seemed to derive little comfort from them. Her prayers, overheard by servants, were less conversations with the divine than rote recitations of gratitude for her comfortable circumstances. Phrases that sounded suspiciously like the scripts Henry had provided for her public statements. Perhaps most heartbreakingly, and began to speak of herself in the third person, as if she were observing her own life from a distance. She would refer to the lady and her needs or preferences, as if she had become a character in someone else's story rather than the author of her own narrative. Anne of Cleves died on July 16, 1557, at Chelsea Old Church, 17 years after her annulment and 10 years after Henry VIII's death. The official cause of death was recorded as cancer, but those who had watched her decline understood that she had been dying by degrees for much longer than that. Her final illness was merely the culmination of a process that had begun the moment she accepted Henry's terms for survival. Her death was as carefully orchestrated as her life had been after her annulment. She died surrounded by the English servants who had monitored her for decades, in the foreign country that had become her prison, speaking prayers in a language that was not her native tongue. Even her final moments were shaped by Henry's vision of who she should be rather than any authentic expression of her own identity. The funeral arrangements revealed the lasting effects of her psychological captivity, and had left detailed instructions for her burial, but these instructions were less personal expressions than careful adherence to the role Henry had assigned her. She requested burial in Westminster Abbey with honors appropriate to her status as the king's beloved sister, as if even in death she could not escape the identity he had imposed upon her. Her will, probated in the months following her death, told the story of a life lived entirely within the boundaries Henry had established. She left generous bequests to her English servants, but nothing to her German family, who had tried repeatedly to maintain contact with her over the years. She donated money to English charitable causes but made no provision for the German religious and educational institutions she had once supported. Even her final act of agency was constrained by the psychological prison that had held her for nearly 2 decades. Most telling of all, Anne's personal possessions, inventoried after her death, revealed almost no traces of her pre-English identity. The German books, musical instruments, clothing, and personal items that had traveled with her from Dusseldorf in 1539 had gradually disappeared over the years, replaced by English equivalents that reflected her assigned role rather than her personal preferences. Her correspondence, preserved in various archives, provides the most chilling evidence of her psychological destruction. The early letters, written in the months following her annulment, maintain traces of her original personality, intelligence, political awareness, cultural sophistication. But as the years passed, her letters became increasingly formulaic, repeating the same phrases about contentment and gratitude until they read less like personal communication than carefully rehearsed performances. The woman who died in 1557 bore little resemblance to the confident German princess who had arrived in England 18 years earlier. Henry VIII had achieved something more complete than execution. He had erased Anne of Cleves' authentic self while keeping her body alive as a testament to his own magnanimity. Anne of Cleves' story represents perhaps the most sophisticated example of psychological warfare in the history of monarchy. Henry VIII accomplished something that no executioner's axe could achieve. He destroyed a human being's sense of self while maintaining the appearance of royal benevolence, and lived for 17 years after her annulment. But the woman who died in 1557 was a hollow shell created by systematic psychological manipulation. The true horror of Anne's fate lies not in its brutality but in its subtlety. She was not dragged to the Tower of London in chains. She was escorted to palaces in silk. She was not tortured in dungeons. She was slowly broken in gardens and drawing rooms. She was not executed by royal decree. She was systematically erased by royal kindness. Modern understanding of psychological trauma helps us recognize what contemporary observers could not fully comprehend. Anne of Cleves was the victim of what we would now call sophisticated emotional abuse. Her physical needs were met with almost obsessive generosity, but her psychological and spiritual needs were systematically starved. She was given every material comfort while being denied every opportunity for meaningful human connection, personal growth, or authentic self-expression. Henry's treatment of and reveals something deeply disturbing about the nature of power and cruelty. The king who could order the execution of wives and ministers with casual indifference demonstrated, in Anne's case, that he understood something even more destructive than physical violence: the power to convince someone that they deserved their suffering, that their pain was evidence of their own inadequacy rather than someone else's cruelty. Anne of Cleves spent the last 17 years of her life publicly grateful for her own destruction. This was Henry VIII's masterpiece of manipulation, creating a victim who would defend her victimizer, a prisoner who would praise her prison, a woman who would thank the man who had stolen her life while leaving her body technically alive. The chilling truth about Anne of Cleves is not that she died, but that she ceased to exist long before her death. The confident, intelligent, politically sophisticated woman who married Henry VIII in January 1540 had been so completely erased by July 1540 that she might as well have been executed. What remained was a carefully constructed performance, a living monument to Henry's ability to destroy someone's soul while claiming to have saved their life. In the end, Anne of Cleves met a death more chilling than execution because she experienced it while still breathing. She was murdered by kindness, executed by generosity, and buried alive in silk and gold. Her story stands as one of history's most perfect crimes, a psychological assassination so complete that even the victim came to believe her killer was her savior. History remembers her as the lucky one who escaped Henry's matrimonial violence. But the truth is far more disturbing. Anne of Cleves didn't escape anything. She simply discovered that there are fates worse than the executioner's block, and sometimes the most effective way to destroy someone is to keep them alive to witness their own annihilation. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more absolutely insane historical content that your teachers were too polite to mention, hit that subscribe button right now, share and comment below. See you in the next one.